In a bygone age, much older than paper and ink, thousands of years before the man humans call Lucretius and the civilization they call Rome, a man sat on a rock wondering what kinds of tribes of man and breeds of beasts he would find in the distant lands across the vast sea. Hundreds of generations later, many of his distant descendants would also somehow find the opportunity to ponder a similar question. Despite the never-ending stream of modern distractions, are we alone in the universe? Many philosophers, scientists, and even laymen would hypothesize why the ever-growing methods of observation seem to find nothing alive beyond themselves in the vast space among the stars. Others, often more idealistic and passionate, would think that first contact was nothing but a foregone conclusion. They would dream of all the ways to help bring forth this sort of communication. Many other smaller groups had their particular views, with some variation of either fearing, worshiping, or denying altogether the possibility of not being alone in the universe. There were as many different opinions and diverse views inspired by that single question as there were people on Earth. So it came as an utter and total shock to the people of the planet when first contact with an alien civilization finally happened, and it happened in a way that had never been theorized by anyone before. They came, made themselves known, brought a gift, and then left. When the chiefs of state from all over the world were informed that something big was happening, it was already over. The visitors had come in their liquid metal spaceships, emerging from a vortex in space. They announced their message in almost 100 different languages at the exact same time. People of the Earth, we have grasped all the fundamental laws of the universe. We have unveiled every single secret that could be unveiled, and we have accomplished everything worth being accomplished. We have reached the end of our road, but we would like to be remembered by those who are still crawling at the beginning. We are going now, but we are leaving behind a gift. Study it, try to figure out how it works, and have fun with it. But most importantly, try not to use it to destroy worlds. Then they said a simple and plain word goodbye. As their message played in every major city of the world, their spaceships deformed into countless holes, releasing a green smoke that comprised a super lightweight powder into the atmosphere. Then, as mysteriously as they had appeared, the spaceships were engulfed by a space vortex, and an instant later, they were nowhere to be seen. All of that took place in less than 2 minutes. The astronomers who had studied their whole lives for this moment didn't even have time to point their antennas and telescopes at the spaceships. The military hadn't even had the chance to take a single plane off the ground to take a closer look at the spaceships, much less fire missiles. The world leaders weren't forced to make any hard decisions in direct response to the aliens, and were only left with the chaos of the aftermath of what would later become known as I-Day. It was all over the news, on the internet, and on every TV channel. Thousands of new videos of the spaceships releasing green smoke were being published every minute, and that trend persisted for a while. But after days, weeks, and months had passed, things began to fall back into place, and most humans were able to put the thoughts of fear, uncertainty, and even expectation to the back of their minds. While humanity's best scientists struggled to find a single trace of the green smoke that had been released by the aliens. But then, 92 days after I-Day, when anything alien-related was starting to feel like second-page material, a young corn farmer from Iowa gained 100 million followers on his social media platforms in a single day and literally reignited people's passion for the topic. He called himself the Burning Man, and his spark would be the first of many that would fuel a world change at a pace, level, and scale never seen before, not even in the Industrial Revolution. 7 years after I-Day, in Nova 3 Smart City, a man wearing a dollar store plastic mask with an all-forever neutral expression was casually strolling the brightly lit streets of the intersection between the commercial and residential districts at exactly 10:02 a.m. "Have you found the target yet?" Sigma said. "Same as a minute ago, D." "Over? Over?" The reply came instantly. Evan sighed as he adjusted the bulky walkie-talkie attached to his belt and made sure the wire looping through his ear and running under his jacket was in a somewhat comfortable position. The cheap material of the components ensured he had to repeat that action at least once every 5 minutes. "I still don't get why we are using these cheap-ass toys instead of just using our phones." "Over. It's safer that way, D." "They're making it harder and harder to get rid of the spyware on the phones, and even I am not confident enough in not getting caught tampering with it in this last firmware update." "Over. I know you will think of something the next time we do this, Sigma." "Oh, I forgot the word again. Over," says the guy who can't even use a walkie-talkie. "Besides, you promised that this would be a one-time thing, D. Over." "Come on, Luke. I mean Sigma. You know how frustrating it is to have this power and be forced to hide it. Evan cut himself short as he realized he had forgotten to press the speak button. Evan face palmed and lost the motivation to repeat himself. After so many consecutive mistakes, he was not this stupid normally, but using his power to disrupt all 8 cameras nearby, while making sure to disrupt any security drone that happened to be patrolling the area, took a serious toll on his mental faculties. Given that he had been doing that non-stop for nearly a full hour, he knew his current performance was nothing to be ashamed of, even though it made him feel awful. It looks like I found something for you, D. Luke's voice took Evan out of his frustration hole. Go along the street until you see that white parked car. Then you'll find the target 2 blocks inside of the commercial district. Finally, Evan said to himself cheerfully, I'm on my way. Brief me on the target as I get there. Over. Don't get your hopes up too soon, D. It might be a false positive. The drone footage showed me 2 guys approaching a blonde girl who looks like she had one too many. It's too distant to get any audio, but her body language suggests she didn't know or want anything to do with them, or at least it looked like that to me. You know I'm not good with people, D. Now she is following them willingly, apparently, but I don't know the circumstances. Over. Roger that. Over. Evan replied shortly as he followed Luke's directions toward the target at his maximum speed, struggling not to run out of breath. Those damn class of heroes must have it easy, flying around as if it's nothing, Evan thought, letting his mind wander about how it would be like flying with his power. This was a habit he couldn't let go of, even when he was possibly about to engage in combat with an unknown duo. But even with that thought, he never forgot to disrupt the cameras in his path as he approached the target. They are right ahead of you, D. I can already see all of you in the same frame. Over. Evan did not reply. He was considering how he would go about dealing with the suspects. It would be too embarrassing if he ended up kicking the asses of those guys only to find out later that they were family members or friends of the blonde girl. Lucky for him, the way one of the guys pushed the woman away without any care, letting her fall onto the sidewalk as soon as he got startled by the loud steps coming from behind them, was almost all Evan needed to determine their culpability. The one closer to the street was a tall black man who was wearing a leather jacket and sharp trousers, which matched nicely with a pair of expensive-looking shoes, while the other was a fat white guy whose most distinctive feature was a nose piercing and the shady dark gray wool hat he was wearing. We ain't here to ruin the girl, man. It's just a weirdo, said the sharply dressed fellow before spitting on the ground as he faced Evan. I've seen one of those before. Must be just a kid playing hero. The fat guy ignored his friend's remark. Hey kid, you know that it's a crime to wear a mask outside nowadays, right? Isn't it a crime to take advantage of someone in that state as well? They must think I'm a teen who doesn't know any better. That will make things interesting. I'm sure the cops will be more interested in that than a random masked man, Evan thought. The face of the tall perp turned ugly at the accusation, but his friend Mark just started laughing and said, she is just a friend, and we are taking her home. Don't forget that there are cameras everywhere. And in the eyes of the law, we were just minding our own business until a frightening masked man showed up with baseless accusations. So much for being the bad guys, I guess. I can only blame fiction for expecting them to react with immediate violence, Evan thought. If she is your friend, you must know her name, right? Despite having nothing to fear, Evan still found it hard to be the one to initiate a fight. This was his first time planning to use his power in an actual confrontation. For an instant, Evan thought he saw a hint of despair on both their faces, but the tall perp named Rye stepped to their rescue. The bitch's name is Mary, now off before the cops show up to arrest you and get us wrapped up in your shit. Upon realizing that Rye was doing his best to sound and look intimidating, Evan concluded that it wouldn't take a whole lot of effort to anger him enough to start a fight. Fate had a different plan, however, as the blonde woman, who had been quietly lying on the ground until that moment, miraculously found the strength to sit up, using both her hands as support. My name is Claire, you jerk, said the blonde before emptying the contents of her stomach without any regard for anything in front of her. A powerful beam of mixed beverages and pieces of undigested food found its way onto the pristine-looking pair of shoes of the black man in an initial burst of strength, only to lose its momentum and fill her own cleavage with its remaining power. Look at what you've done. The black man didn't take kindly to having his shoes ruined and grabbed Claire by the neck with his left hand, his right hand turning into a fist as he prepared to deliver some twisted punishment. Stop it. Evan stretched his right hand toward the soon-to-be aggressor. The bad habit of repeating this action when he was about to use his power on living targets was something he was actively trying to get rid of, but it was hard to prevent on the spur of the moment. In the span of a couple of milliseconds, dozens of overlapping images corresponding to the most varied flows of energy flooded Evan's mind. He effortlessly ditched most of them as background noise while keeping only the one corresponding to the flow of electrons. From there, he consciously filtered out the electronic devices such as phones, underground power lines, and even car system circuitry, only to remain with a single view: the electrons moving in the nervous system of one individual. Now it was high time for some disruption. Currently, the lower target limit of Evan's disruptive powers consisted of a small group of human cells, and anything smaller than that was outside his reach. But that was more than enough to deal with his current target. All he needed to do was to increase the electric resistance of a couple of the neurons of the man's peripheral nervous system from where the target's arms connected with their thorax, and the job was done. What the? The feeling of having both of his arms go limp at the same time led the aggressor to release Claire and lose his intimidating bravado. This guy is a telekinetic freak. Mark, be careful. Evan was baffled by how someone personally affected by his power would think that his ability had a telekinetic nature, but since that was the most common ability that could be awakened, it was nothing but expected that the general population would react in that way. Now all that remained for him to see was how the other perp would react. Thank you. You've just given me legal clearance to act in self-defense. Mark laughed at the situation. I've always wanted to test my powers against a fellow telekinetic user, and now I can. Finding someone with powers on my first time doing this? What are the odds? Evan was so happy to finally have a chance to let loose with his power that he almost couldn't believe it was actually happening. Mark was not in a hurry to start the fight. From his perspective, Evan was still busy using his powers to restrain his friend Rye, and he had time to get something special. He reached into his pocket and grabbed 3 industrial ball bearings the size of an average chicken egg. Evan watched Mark's actions with interest and without trying to interfere with whatever he was doing, which made the perp interpret his inaction as a sign of fear, since he couldn't see Evan's face. I guess you can imagine what I'm about to do. Mark was referring to a popular video that had gained a lot of traction in the not-so-small telekinetic community, where a general of the United Nations recently formed army would demonstrate what he was calling the ultimate offensive and defensive move for a telekinetic user. Evan had no idea how Mark intended to use those ball bearings, but from the moment they started to float above the perp's hands until they went into an erratic pattern circling Mark's body at a staggeringly high speed, Evan remained standing still without showing any reaction whatsoever. Mark started with a full defensive pattern, where the ball bearings would always remain close to his body. He wanted to see if Evan would attempt to throw random things at him since he assumed Evan's power was the same as his own, and most TKs, as the telekinetic users like to call themselves, would often do when put under pressure. Evan was not one of them, however. His incessant inaction caused Mark to get bolder and bolder in his attacks until all 3 ball bearings were grazing Evan's hair frighteningly often. Come on, where's your fear? All Mark needed to justify putting a metal sphere through Evan's skull was a sudden reaction. It was only when Mark decided to take a piece of Evan's ear off that he finally reacted. It all transpired in an instant. When Mark was performing the final trajectory correction to aim for the ear, he noticed he was unable to control the ball bearings. He tried again to regain control of the metallic spheres, this time using all his power, but to no avail. It felt like they had suddenly become a bottomless pit that was consuming all of his power. As he persisted in the fool's errand, he noticed that the ball bearings were glowing bright and hot as each of them moved further away from Evan in random directions. Mark watched apprehensively as a nearby parked vehicle caught fire after being hit by one of his glowing spheres. No less disturbing were 2 new glowing dots in the concrete wall of the newly constructed building across the street. That's unfortunate. Evan was genuinely regretful about how things went down. Since his power could neither add nor remove momentum from moving targets, he thought that his disruption of the force that Mark was applying to the metal spheres in a way that Mark's telekinetic powers would compress them from all directions instead of moving them would result in nullifying all movement. But he forgot that by compressing something, the energy applied would not just disappear and instead be converted to heat. It's all your fault. I'm not going to jail over this. Knowing how severe the laws against misuse of the powers given by the aliens were, Mark lost composure and gave up his rationality. Don't do this, bro. said Rye at the sight of his friend, lifting a car from the ground with his telekinesis and preparing to throw it at Evan. Evan would have stopped him the moment he realized the perp had lost his mind, but the intense use of his disruptive powers ensured a moment of hesitation from him, as the fear of the intense headache he would certainly get if he tried to disrupt one more thing in so little time clouded his judgment. The tipping point, however, happened when the car was already as high as the average house and moving toward the space above his head. Evan abandoned all hesitation and released his previous disruption on Rye's arms as a means to attenuate the burden of what he was about to do. If he could, Evan would also let go of the disruption of the nearby cameras, but he would take a bad headache every time over the prospect of being arrested. Evan knew the more time this fight took to end, the worse his situation would be, so he took no chances this time. He forgot about the flow of kinetic energy and focused solely on the flow of electrons. With a clear view of Mark's nervous system in his mind, Evan lowered the electric resistance of a solid chunk of the perp's neurons in a fell swoop. Claire watched in awe as the individual and the vehicle fell in synchrony. Both the car and Mark reached the ground nearly at the same time, the latter suffering considerably less damage from the fall. Rye and Claire both found the scene of the masked man with his right hand stretched toward the fallen Mark, who was clearly having a seizure, quite disturbing, terrifying even. It was nothing compared to the perceived sense of security that the class of heroes would give off when they would land, kick some asses, and save the day. Claire screamed in fear while Rye reached out for a gun, under the impression that the fact Evan was still pointing his hand at his fallen friend meant that he was still using his powers. The truth, however, was that Evan was spacing out due to the overuse of his power, and his stretched hand was only there because the intense pain paralyzed his movements. D, the black dude has a gun. Do something now. The urgency of the situation made even Luke forget how to use a walkie-talkie properly. The voice on the earpiece took Evan out of his quagmire, and the first thing his brain processed was the image of a gun aimed at his face a couple of steps away from him. Rye was holding it with both hands, and his aim was solid. Time stopped for a moment, and Evan drowned in a huge dose of adrenaline. The strength to remain focused was something he had lost, but in the face of imminent death, his mind acted without much thinking. There was no place for finesse or grace in that situation, and Evan disrupted every single neuron in Rye's body as a single set without regard for the aftermath. Acting without thinking had its consequences, nonetheless, and Rye's muscles began to contract and relax at random, which inevitably led him to pull the trigger.